Thank you, Frans, for these strong words. We will start with the first round of questions, as usual, with the coordinators, and then a second round of 10 speakers already on my list, and there will be no more time for additional catch the eye. So let's start with the EPP and Peter Liese.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I hope you can hear me because my connection was not the best when I listened to you and to Vice President Timmermans. But if you don't intervene, I just go ahead. So thank you for the presentation. I would make 5 small points and questions. First of all, it is good that also today we started with the health issue, because it is very clear, as important the environment may be, in the moment the health is a priority, and we have to show that we do whatever we can do. Second point, the corona crisis is also a huge economic challenge that cannot be denied. But third point, climate change doesn't go away. We still have the challenge, and we are really in a serious climate crisis when we don't act. And I'm very grateful that Ursula von der Leyen made this point last week in the plenary. The Green Deal is not gone. It is still important. And I may add a fourth point, personal point. I think the coronavirus pandemic and the behavior of President Trump is another reason why many, many people hope that he will not be re-elected in November. Then Europe must be ready. When we have a president that is ready to talk and to act on climate change, we need to have an offer to him. That's why I think we, according to the circumstances and carefully, we need to continue. And the fifth point is my question to Vice President Timmermans. I think a lot depends on the ways and means how we continue now. It is very clear that money that we invest for the recovery should respect the target of climate neutrality. But we need to be careful when it comes to very painful regulation that is challenging for industry that is in a crisis already now. I don't think we can avoid it completely, but we have to think carefully. And I would ask the Vice President, what are his considerations after? Okay, I was finished.
Okay, are you done? Okay, suggest we move to...
What the Vice President is thinking about adapting the Green Deal in this way.
Okay, so we will move to S&D Group and Jutta Gutteland. Nice glass, Jutta. Nice glass, Jutta.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, this is not good. Okay. First and foremost, also in these extraordinary circumstances, it's imperative that EU remains firm in its commitment to combat climate change, and I'm very happy to hear you emphasize that as a commissioner. I'm really happy to listen to you. On the proposed EU climate law, the flagship of the Green Deal, the Parliament is committed to maintain our schedule and vote in plenary in September. And I'm eager to hear your timetable. And also, when do you expect the member states to have their first position on your proposal? So both the Commission and the member state, the timetable on the EU climate law. I would also like to ask you about the COP26 in Glasgow, as we all know was postponed. is nothing to do about, but I would like to say that it's also important that this year we should have the NDCs reported in line with the Paris Agreement. I wonder if you have what will happen now when we don't have the COP26 in November. Then finally, I also have a question on the aviation and CORSIA. Me and the other coordinators, we did send a letter to you about the process in DG Move, which are currently drafting a proposal which would legally bind the EU to implement CORSIA using Article 218(9) in TIF EU. And this article only commits the Parliament to be informed, and this not be in line with the ETS directive, which explicitly says that any decision on the implementation of this EU Union law should fully involve the European Parliament. So we are really not happy with this. So I would like to hear how do you see upon it, and also because this is not good for climate if we are not involved. Thank you.
Okay, the connections are not that good. And this morning it was perfect, so I hope that it will be better for the following speakers. We move to Renew and Niels Torvalds.
Thank you, Pascal, and thank you, Frans Timmermans, for being here. And I had a lot of questions from my colleagues, but you actually, in your first interventions, you actually answered to those questions. So I go directly to a Winnie the Pooh quote. When you are a bear with very little brain and you think of things, you find sometimes that the thing which seems so very thingish inside you is quite different when it goes out into the open and other people looking at it. So, and this quote from Winnie goes for me, but it also goes for the climate law. When I was reading the Commission's approach to the climate law and the proposal on climate law, then I didn't find sort of the great envelope. So I had to go back to what you or the Commission came out with in the 300 plus pages in-depth analysis for the Clean Planet for All. And if you go into those papers and go down to page 334, then you see something which is called a carbon budget. And this carbon budget is sort of the logical framework for all the actions we should see in connection with the Green Deal, and therefore the climate law should be sort of the envelope of this climate budget. But when I tried to speak, and my assistant tried to speak to people from the Commission, they seemed to shy away from the word carbon budget, even if, according to my information, all the calculations for the climate law, for the trajectory, for the ETS, for the burden sharing, for the LULUCF, they are all actually done on the basis of a carbon budget. And therefore, I would be very happy to see the Commission coming out with a clear definition of how this climate budget could look. And if you have some problems there, I think it would be better to sort of go through the problems before we have a vote, and as long as we can adjust the Parliament's position to the climate law according. I think this is my main concern, and I would be very happy with a clear answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Niels. We move to ID and Silvia Saldone.
Buongiorno.
Good afternoon, Mr. Timmermans. Good afternoon, Chairman. Good afternoon, fellow members. The majority has said no to our proposal.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much, because we cannot see you.
and the interpreters cannot do their job. Thank you, Madam.
Can I restart, please?
It's okay, so you can start again.
Can I have the time? Okay, thank you. Buongiorno.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Timmermans. Good afternoon, fellow members. As you know, the majority has rejected the proposal that we put to the committee to keep coronavirus as a priority topic for the debate. But the majority said the Green Deal couldn't wait. I think the people that can't wait today are those that are on ventilators in hospitals. But of course, everybody has their opinion. According to estimates from the IMF, we're going to see a GDP drop of 7.5%, and for my country, it will be 9.1%. According to the ILO, we're looking at 25 million unemployed people in the world as a result of the economic crisis which will occur. So I think there we need to think about the Green Deal. We've got companies which are shut down. We need to help them to open up again. We shouldn't be thinking just about encouraging them to use less plastic, for example. According to the stages decided upon by the Commission in September, we'll have an impact study being presented, and that will tell us whether or not, or what levels compared to 1990 we'll be looking at in terms of emissions. Could I ask whether or not you've taken into account the macroeconomic effects of the coronavirus, or have you perhaps could we perhaps look at putting off the whole issue of putting forward these changes in levels for a year or so until we find ourselves in a better position? We don't want to end up with problems where medical equipment is blocked and the countries which most need them can't have them. Furthermore, I've read an interview in which you said that there could be some leniency when it comes to funding for pharmaceuticals, for medicines and so. But we need to think really about what we're doing. I mean, we've had problems in the past. Now with the coronavirus, things are going to be much worse.
For the Greens, passe à écoute.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and thank you, Mr. Timmermans, for your words on the importance of the Green Deal. I think you find a big majority of the Parliament supporting that notion, so happy to hear that. But of course, now and then you hear conflicting stories or conflicting sounds, also from the Commission or whatsoever. So I do think it is important when you are replying to the questions that you make a couple of issues very clear so that people know what we can expect from the Commission. So to go through a couple of those. First of all, we do know that very important elements of the Green New Deal, being the biodiversity strategy and the from farm to fork strategy, which, by the way, is to a very large extent a strategy for consumers, which is very crucial. We know that was postponed already to the end of April, but we hear it will be further postponed again. Can you very clearly clarify how and when they will be presented, because I don't think much more postponement of biodiversity and farm to fork can be tolerated if you really look at that these are very crucial elements for the Green Deal. Then on aviation, when we are talking about conditionality, you say that the Commission's position is that countries can do some conditioning, but the problem is, of course, if every country is going to have that separate debate, then there is not a European solution to that. And here, the European Commission needs to have a very clear view on that as well. And with that, one commissioner who's saying we don't want conditions and you say, well, it's up to member states to do that, I think that is a very bad signal. So please clarify more what the Commission is intending to do to make sure there is a European strategy on green conditioning for sectors like the aviation sector. Last point on the budget. That will be presented next week, but we are a bit afraid that we are getting a kind of a new Juncker plan, but then with the entire European budget, and that we we know that then maybe how big that budget will be through all kind of multiplication factors is more important than really the greening aspect. And the greening has already been very much criticized in the previous budget. So what is the Commission going to do in order to make sure that this European budget will really be used for greening of our economy, which indeed is so crucial to get out of this crisis? And how are you going to match that with all the national programs? Because there is much more money than only the European budget, and we really need to work together as a European economy to get in a sustainable way out of this crisis. And clear answers from you would be very much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For ECR, Alexander Vondra.
Yeah, thank you, Pascal. Thank you, Frans, for your comments. So, look, to state in the beginning, we are fully committed with the 2050 climate neutrality goal, but my group disagrees with you on the way how to achieve the results in the next couple of years, which we see as very unrealistic. Firstly, the pandemic is far from being over. The WHO is warning that the worst is yet ahead of us, and it could be there a second wave. So we should focus all the energy to fix this challenge. Secondly, Europe and the whole world face unprecedented economic recession. You know, it can easily reach the double-digit numbers. So if we ignore this, we might see not just the welcome social distancing among the people in our societies, but also very unwelcome distancing between the people and their leaders throughout Europe. And thirdly, in the light of the postponement of COP26, there is no time to rush. China, the US, India, and Brazil would certainly not rush either. So here are my couple of questions. So do you have a plan to revive the work program further beyond what is being leaked as the epidemic continues to evolve? Is there a scenario where the Commission will consider longer-term delays to the costliest Green Deal, like the targets for 2030 initiatives, in order to ease the significant social and economic impact of the crisis on the people's lives and livelihoods? Secondly, should the Commission decide to maintain its October deadline for 2030 climate target, can you explain how a potentially significant fall in the EU GDP will be factored in the data used for the impact assessment and the 2030 roadmaps? I fear that this impact assessment fails to account for the pending global recession, then we will not identify what is achievable at all. This impact assessment must demonstrate member states' capacity for emission reduction over the decade ahead, not just simply reiterate political will. And finally, this industry currently looking at ways to conserve money and save jobs, it has been very difficult for businesses to engage in the consultation phase of the 2030 climate target plan. Recalling a remark from your parliamentary hearing last October that, and I quote, arguments will be more convincing if we can back them up with research and facts, and quote, what evidence base will you use if industry does not respond?
Thank you. Thank you. And the last speaker for the first round will be Sylvia Monique for the GUE.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me, and hopefully all of you are well. Thank you, Mr. Timmermans, for your brief, and thank you for finding the time to talk to the committee. That is extremely important. As you probably and everyone else has noticed, the climate work has become increasingly difficult during this crisis. There are those who use this crisis as an excuse not to make the necessary decisions that the climate needs, and that is an excuse. They haven't been willing to do that in the first place. But I wish that you will continue, and the Commission will continue to strongly promote the paradigm that rebuilding from this crisis and greening our societies, they're not opposite things. There is a synergy within that. We can have them both. They are not against this other. It doesn't mean that if we do one, we cannot do the other. There's a synergy there, and there's a win-win situation there. And this I hope that you will promote strongly and not back down. So it's become more difficult, and it doesn't help that in our point of view, the climate law proposal from the Commission was inadequate. It would need more ambition, and the Parliament will put that into the proposal. But how do we make sure now that, because it is true, we cannot afford to make subsidies and aids for companies and societies to rebuild to the old world, the carbon world. We have to put the money to rebuild into the new and sustainable world. How are we going to do that when at the same time we read, for example, news, the central bank is buying debt out of all big gas and oil giants, as we heard that they are doing in the UK as well. And then we have the member states' own programs and state aids and subsidies, which also can work in a different way. So what is your plan to get this all in the same direction, working for a future-proof economy and a society, because there's a big risk? And I also, as Bas, I want to ask about farm to fork and biodiversity strategy. When are those coming? We cannot afford to postpone them anymore. And also, there is a clear link between how the biodiversity is doing and viruses like this. And how do you see the biodiversity's well-being being has a role in all of this? Thanks.
Thank you. So back to Frans Timmermans.
Thank you very much. And let me start by underlying what Peter Liese said, that health is our top priority now. People are suffering, people are in hospitals. We need to make sure that we support everyone who's fighting for their lives and make sure they can do their jobs, and make sure that we become more resilient as Europeans, because this pandemic will be with us for quite some time in different forms. But we have to get used to the fact that this fight is far from over. So there is no, I don't want to create the impression that I'm so entirely focused on the Green Deal that I don't see what's happening around us. But the paradox is that it would be a dereliction of duty if I did not link the two and say very clearly that if we really want to come out of this stronger and future-oriented, we absolutely need to make the transformation towards a green society. We need to do that. We need to do that because we need a circular economy, we need sustainable jobs, we need people to have to create a better balance between ourselves and our natural environment. The world will need to feed perhaps up to 10 billion people, and it will have to be done in a sustainable way. And we need, indeed, we need to make sure that we do not distort our relation with our natural environment in such a way that pandemics become a regular phenomenon because of our lack of understanding of our relationship with our natural environment. So let's not fall into the trap of thinking that the Green Deal is sort of a luxury we could not afford in this crisis. I think it's a lifeline out of the crisis. Now, of course, also reacting to Mr. Liese, of course we will take into account what is happening in the industries. Of course we will look at sectoral approaches to help our industries get out of the crisis, and if it is necessary, we will look at some of the issues, whether they can be speeded up or should be slowed down. But let's do this in a rational way, and let's not fall into the trap that some might want to use the COVID-19 crisis as an excuse to try and undo things that need to be done anyway. So I really did not appreciate some people writing to me and using the need for PPE in the health sector as a reason not to have a ban on certain single-use plastic items. There was no relationship between the two, and we should not create that sort of relationships. But at the same time, we should have an open ear and an open mind for industries that will face some serious short-term challenges, but it should not dissuade us from the necessity to stick to our goals step by step to get there. Now, we will, as I said, come up with our impact assessed target for 2030 in September. And then we will immediately submit that to the Council, and then it will be up to Member States to look into that. I will urge Member States as much as I can to maintain the same timetable that we had before the postponement of COP26. There's no reason why that should be postponed. And let me assure those who have asked that in doing the impact assessment, I think Sascha Vonder also asked that, we will obviously use the latest available figures we have, including of the development of the gross domestic product and other elements that are of importance for the impact assessment. As far as the COSIA issue is concerned and the involvement of the European Parliament, of course we will follow the logic and the procedure of the ETS directive. Let me be very clear about that, and I think this is something that has also been communicated to IATA, so they know that. I see we're back at the issue of the climate budget. That is not the logic of our proposal. As you know, we work with emission reduction targets and not with the climate budget. Of course, if you look through, as Mr. Torvald said, if you look through the development of our plans, you could distill from that the space we would have in terms of how much space we can use in terms of emissions. And you can then translate that to a climate budget. But that's not the logic the Commission follows. We want to stick to the agreed logic of emissions reductions leading up to climate neutrality in 2050. Now, let me again, but I think most of it I already answered, again, underline that it is really false logic to contradict, to oppose the Green Deal to us facing this biggest crisis in 80 years, this biggest challenge in 80 years. These are completely interlinked, and I think we would do our citizens a huge disservice if we were not completely honest about the fact that things will not go back to how they were. Things will not go back to how they were. So we have to make sure that we can give our society such an impulse to find a new force to reform in the direction that would create a sustainable society in the long run. And I think that would give Europe, by the way, a huge competitive advantage vis-à-vis other parts of the world who will certainly want to partner up with us sooner or later. But as much as we stick to that, the more we stick to this, the more others will do the same. Now, so there is, it would be a dereliction of duty not to insist on the Green Deal as a growth strategy to get us out of this crisis. Now, the question about whether Italy should use EDF funds or not, ESM funds or not, I was clear in an interview in an Italian newspaper today. You know, I would just hope you would not make politics out of this. I would just hope, when you think about the availability of these funds with no conditions, that could alleviate the incredible suffering of people working in healthcare. I just hope that we would think about the doctors and the nurses when we think about these possibilities, rather than whether we can score political points out of that or or increase the feeling of resentment and anger. I think let's think about our true heroes today when we think about these things. Will be my advice. When will we come with our biodiversity and farm to fork strategy? It will be, the initial plan was the end of April. It might be a couple of weeks later, certainly not months. But I can't, because this is now, everything is up in the air, but I'm putting maximum pressure. It will not be postponed for months. It will not be months. It might be a couple of weeks, but that's more or less it. And we are working very hard to make that happen. Now, on state aid and other investment strategies, the question here was, that was put to me, can member states apply criteria such as greening with state aid? The answer to that is yes. But that's the answer to only that question. It is absolutely clear that if we want this recovery to lead to the maximum results, member states and the Commission should give guidance on this, and the European Parliament should give guidance on this. Member states should align their efforts, should come to terms with what sort of criteria would help the recovery happening in the right direction, in the right way. We should avoid state aid becoming a competition issue between member states, because obviously some member states have more breathing space, have more fiscal capacity to do state aid than others, and this state aid should not be used as an instrument to increase the differences between member states. So obviously we need European coordination on this, and I'm sure that this will be something that most, if not all, of the member states will want us to look into as well. As far as the MFF is concerned, Mr. Eickhout wanted a straight answer. You get a straight answer. I can't tell you today because we're still working on that. And when the plans are ready, Parliament will be the first to know. But we are in the process of working on that. Do we have plans of revisiting the Commission work programme? We're also in the process of doing that under the expert leadership of Maroš Šefčovič to take into account. Because, as I said earlier, we need to prioritise those things that have an immediate effect on growth and employment, and have an immediate effect on helping sectors recover or reform in the right direction. And yes, we will take into account the fall of the GDP and impact assessment. And yes, what we will do will be evidence-based. And if I'm not convinced about the evidence, then we will wait until I am convinced about the evidence. I think I've also answered Ms. Modic's question on the paradigm shift and on farm to fork and biodiversity. Over back to you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you, Frans, and thank you for answering straightly the questions. So we will move to the second round of questions. I will ask you to stick to 1 minute each, starting with the EPP and Mary McGuinness.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Vice President Timmermans. Thank you for your presentation and indeed the answers you've just given. I have some questions. What is your view about independent advisory councils? Some member states already have them. And what is your perspective about them being involved in the European climate law? Secondly, on the impact assessment for 2030, we await that in September. How will you account for 2020, which is and will be an unusual year, and how do you take that into account in your calculations? The third point around emissions and carbon sinks. What is the balance there? And have you any points on that so that we could further understand your thinking within the Commission? And the issue of cutting emissions, we all appreciate and we're all moving in that direction, but we know what's happened of late is that the economies have shut down and emissions have shut down. So that's not a good result. What we need is to have an economy that is growing and is green. What impact, though, will this coronavirus have on our rate of change? Because we're trying, and all of us agree with you, we have to stick with the path we're on. But surely there is an impact of the pandemic, and perhaps you have already had some thoughts around that. The financial impact is one, and that's going to be huge. And will Europe have the resources to do what it needs to do? Thank you.
Thank you. For Renew, Frédéric Ries, who is in the room.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mr. Vice President, you're back, I hope. I hope everything is well for you and your family. Thanks to you to having decided to stay the course and maintain the goal of our shared ambitions on the Green Deal. A lot of things have been said already, so may I focus on something you touched upon. Some, and you mentioned some, are already taking advantage of the coronavirus crisis to challenge our objectives, but also to target our achievements. And you did mention the single-use plastic directive. Sectors of the industry in America, in Europe also, are now surfing the wave, if I say so, and demanding the postponement of the application and the lifting of the bans. You sort of reassured me, but what if now they would target other parts of the strategy, the microplastic initiative, the packaging initiative? What can you tell us about this? Did you receive any other requests and demands to lower our ambitions? And one last, maybe even more political questions. On the last words you said in your preliminary remarks, you said, more crucially, we have to convince the people that the Green Deal is not a luxury. And this is the threat now, bringing people on board, not only to accept it, but to support it. What is your magic wand, Mr. Timmermans? How are we going to get this?
Thank you. For SND, Miriam Daly. So Miriam Daly is not apparently connected, so we will move to... Oh, she's there. Okay.
I'm here. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, and thank you to Vice President Frans Timmermans for this brief. I will refer to what you said, Vice President Timmermans, when you said that the Green Deal is not a luxury. But it is pretty evident that there will be those who will use coronavirus as an excuse to undermine the European Green Deal. And we as SND are totally contrary to this approach because we believe that it is short-sighted. And the Green Deal has to be at the core of the EU recovery plan. But that's why we ask you for your commitment as Vice President, which you showed today, but also the commitment of the whole European Commission, both to the ambition and to the timeline of the Green Deal. I will go straight to the Farm to Fork strategy because this is one of the main proposals that we are awaiting as a European Parliament. You mentioned the timeline, but another risk is to lower ambition. Can you ensure a strong proposal that will include binding regulatory measures, particularly when it comes to tackling pesticides and fertilizers, and a proposal that can also create a climate-smart agricultural system that provides healthy food, whilst obviously retaining a good living for EU farmers and fishermen? Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Miriam, and say hello to your kids behind. We move to Adam Jarubas, who is now back with us after a couple of hard weeks, I heard.
Panie Przewodniczący, cieszę się w sposób szczególny, że mogę wziąć udział w dzisiejszej dyskusji, gdyż jestem osobą, która miała szczęście.
Thank you very much. I'm quite interested in taking part in this discussion because I'm somebody who was lucky enough to recover from coronavirus. We need to link our recovery with economic recovery as well. So we need to help businesses meet the challenges for the future. We need to protect our economy as necessary. One of the solutions which the Commission has suggested is the carbon adjustment mechanism at the borders, but that would be introduced with conditionalities. Couldn't we shouldn't privilege that over other protection measures that we have. We should be looking at promoting measures which would allow industry in third countries to adopt low emissions technology. One of the instruments being talked about is the Equal Transition Fund, or the Fair Transition Fund. The European Commission is thinking about putting off the deadlines for introducing best available technologies into companies, since they aren't able to prepare for the epidemic. Thank you.
Mr. Jadot, could you please press the speak button?
Okay. Sorry. Monsieur le Vice-Président,
Vice President of the Commission, you mentioned the issue of conditionalities for state aids in the aviation sector, to some extent to justify the unacceptable comments made by Commissioner Vălean. If it's the Commission who's providing flexibilities on state aids, then a framework should have been provided for these new kinds of state aid. Second question, the Green Deal is under threat from inside the European Union, but also from outside the European Union. Indonesia is casting doubt on what's going on the rules for the forests, and we're seeing that the United States are going doing even worse when it comes to climate change because of COVID-19. Now, if the impact of the pandemic has an effect both within and outside the European Union, then we need to take the steps necessary. We need to make sure that we have carbon adjustment measures, because otherwise all European Union companies are going to face unfair competition from those outside its borders. So I reiterate my question. Can we speed up the debate and the instructions and the decision on carbon border adjustment measures? It's an essential part of the Green Deal.
We move to Sylvia Limer, who is in the room for ID.
Danke. Thank you. Commission presented or declared a climate emergency in November last year, but with the outbreak of the corona pandemic, we were reminded in a very unfortunate manner what a real emergency is. Individual member states of the EU are now turning out to be the managers of the crisis, not the Commission or the European Parliament. And I mean, the total failure of the EU in the corona crisis would be bad enough, but now it still wants to continue working on the climate law as soon as possible in some kind of totalitarian way. This is going to be impossible in the current economic environment. It's a complete nonsense. But an economy that has been weakened by a pandemic would be the worst circumstances to try to implement this. Is this just not further proof of how far away the Commission is from reality? Doesn't it show that just clinging to these green utopia is just, the next nail in the coffin after Brexit?
Opponents, as well as you do the supporters of the Green Deal. Thank you.
For SND, César Luena.
Hola.
Okay, go ahead.
Está bien, ¿verdad? Sí, gracias, señor Timmermans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timmermans. I wanted to make a couple of comments on justice and ambition. On the first of these points, I'd like you to tell us about plans for reconstruction. Our group supports that, but we would like you to take into account the whole issue of tax measures. We need to think about the environment, but I think that we need to be taking steps on these whole issues now. And on climate change, as Mrs. Daly and Mrs. Houteland said, we're interested in the biodiversity strategy. On the 29th of April, we're going to see the plan being put out. Will that happen? And then I'd like you to keep to the ambitious objectives which the Parliament has adopted in one of its resolutions on the biodiversity strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. For the non-attached, Eleonora Evi.
Sì, buongiorno.
Good afternoon to the Chairman. Good afternoon, Vice President Timmermans. I'd like to go back to the biodiversity strategy and farm to fork. The pandemic has shown how building up forests and protecting biodiversity and natural habitats is another way of endangering people's health, because the contact with wild animals can be a transmission vector. This is something which is causing more problems throughout the world, with the felling of forests and jungles to feed animals, which are then used for human consumption. We're also seeing more and more intensive production, for example, in Europe, and that's something which leads to a greater transmission of diseases. Things are going to be particularly bad where there are areas of low pollution, such as the Padana Plains in Italy. That shows that particles in the air can help the coronavirus to survive for days and thus to spread further. So, as you've said, of course you can't have economic policy without having an ambitious environmental policy either, but we shouldn't be taking steps backwards. We should be thinking about all of these issues and the importance of the biodiversity strategy and farm to fork. And I hope that this can finally be an opportunity to put forward ambitious proposals and talk about finally doing away with the use of cages in industrial rearing in farms, and also helping farms to produce more efficiently whilst using less antimicrobials.
Thank you. We move to Anna Zaliuska for ECR. Go ahead.
Hello. Dzień dobry. Witam. Cieszę się, że widzę Państwa w zdrowiu.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to see you all in good health. I think that's the most important thing at the moment. Here I would say I'm somewhat surprised from what I've just heard from Mr. Timmermans, and I think that a lot of European Union citizens would share that surprise. He spoke to European Union citizens saying that he was thinking about their future, the future of their children and of their companies, and he has just said that they should be changing car, so go out and buy a new car. I think, Mr. Timmermans, you have to give up these kinds of political statements. The world has changed, and we need to take a more humble approach to what we're thinking about for the future and how much we're going to have to adapt. We need to take into account the effect of the epidemic and think about changes to our budgets as well, because the prime concern is the health of our citizens and making sure that our economies can continue to work. We, of course, are worried about the climate, but we need to be careful about the choices we make. You talked about the European Commission delegation and what's going on outside the scope of the treaties. But this allows the Commission to take decisions alone on the 2030 climate objectives. I think we have to change our discourse, be a lot more humble, and think about the budget.
Mr. Kokelis for the GUE.
Thank you, and hello to everyone. Mr. Timmermans, in a recent article, you asked which world do we want after COVID-19, and shall we try to return to the old or build a better one? Do we want a pandemocracy, a state of pandemic with more surveillance, more authoritarianism, a state of economy which leaves even more people behind? Or do we want a pandemocracy, a place with democracy for all, a place where we take everyone forward, a place where we have climate justice? In the new, I think you made yourself clear which one do you want, and we want the same. In the upcoming Council on Thursday, the Commission is expected to present its ideas on the new MFF as a new green Marshall Plan with expanded EU-owned resources and perhaps perpetual recovery bonds. Do you believe that this will be also be used forward as Green Deal bonds in the end of the day? Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you all stick to the time, we have the time, and Frans Timmermans agreed to have a third round of questions. So I will give the floor to Frans Timmermans for answers and for answering this second round of questions, but we will also open the floor for the third and last one. So I will ask you, if you want to have the floor, to push the button, raise the floor, which is on your device, and we will collect your will, and then we will make a list of speakers when Frans is answering the second round of questions. I hope it's clear. So we move to the answers from Frans Timmermans to the second round. Frans, up to you.
Thank you very much, President. Would we envisage independent advisory councils in preparing our plans? Well, we will try and solicit as much independent advice as we can get, and we will be looking at ways of rallying everybody with a stake in this into helping us devise the best possible plans. I know this is happening in various member states as we speak. And I think we can learn from that. And once again, the more input we get from people who do not have, except for their expertise and their background, a vested interest one way or the other, I think would help us improve the quality of our work. Now, how do we take into account what is happening now into the impact assessment we do? As much as we can. As much as we can, we will use the last possible available data we have to make sure that our impact assessment accounts for what is happening now. I will have to look into this a bit more detail and come back to you what this means explicitly, because these are complicated mechanisms and complicated schemes. And if I may, I will come back to you on exactly how we organize this. But I think the value of our impact assessment and the credibility of our impact assessment will increase if we take into account the latest possible and best possible data. As we have declared that we want to be climate neutral by 2050, it is absolutely clear that this is not only going to be through the reduction of emissions, and that probably emissions will not, hopefully they have, but they might not have been reduced to zero by then. But then if on balance with carbon sinks, we do have a climate neutrality environment, then I think it is clear that we have attained our goals. So in combining emission reductions to zero or near to zero with increasing carbon sinks, we will get to where we need to be. And at some point, we would have to go beyond climate neutrality to create even a plus in terms of the reduction. And how do we create these carbon sinks? Well, various ways, but one of the strategies we will come out with is our forestry strategy. And forestry is going to be an important answer in terms of carbon sinks, and forestry not just in terms of the big services of forests, but also greening of cities and greening of urban areas, etc. So I'm really very enthusiastic about that strategy, and it is good for health as well, and good for the temperature in cities, good for the climates in cities, good for the air quality in cities, and it is good also in terms of the rural areas and opportunities in the rural areas, and also new economic opportunities in the rural areas, and it has a huge net positive effect on our biodiversity, apart from creating carbon sink. Now, of course, the impact of the pandemic will be studied very closely, and if this means that we need to fine-tune or change or mitigate or change the pace of our reform, we will certainly do that. We are not tone deaf to what is happening. But let me reiterate, you cannot just say we're now in the pandemic, so forget about climate change, because it is here. I'll come back to that in a moment. Ms. Ries asked me, did you get more letters asking for postponement or scrapping of measures? Not yet. Well, there are some indirect indications, but nothing yet. Will some people or industries who did not like certain legislation to start with try and convince us that now is not the time to do this? Of course they will, and we will look carefully at their arguments. But I think we should stick as much as possible to the agenda we have declared. Do I have a magic wand to convince everyone? Well, I think, frankly, the way... First of all, I think there is still a very strong public support for us to tackle climate change. That has not disappeared at all. But secondly, I believe the credibility of our plans will usually increase if we are capable to show that by doing this, there are quick results for economic growth and for jobs. That is why I think we should identify a number of sectors that will profit immediately if we invest in them. And I think building is important in this. You know, if you help people change the energy mix of their housing so they reduce their energy cost, if you help them insulate the housing, or if you help them refurbish or put solar panels on their roofs, this leads to jobs that cannot be delocalized. These are local jobs. These are jobs that especially engage small and medium-sized enterprises, and these are jobs that lead to results that people like. The value of their housing goes up, the energy bill goes down, etc., etc. And if we can organize this at a scale which is European, then I think financing it is not going to be as difficult as sometimes thought, because I know that a lot of banks are interested in this because the risk is very low to them. So I think quick results, showing that it works, is how you rally people around this. Now, on farm to fork, yes, it's going to be a strong proposal. Yes, I mean, you can't, in terms of the biodiversity strategy and farm to fork, in terms of pesticides and other issues, these are intimately linked. And this will also be clear when we come out with the proposal. Now, moving to the issue of carbon border measures. They might be necessary or will be necessary if we move in a certain direction, others in the world don't, and then we need to protect our industry so that there is no carbon leakage and that our industry is not put at a disadvantage. But at the same time, and I would insist on that, we should convince our international partners that moving in the same direction is a better solution than introducing carbon border adjustment. So we have that as a possibility, but our first objective is to convince others to move in the same direction. That's why we invest a lot in climate diplomacy as well with our major partners. And I still am quite confident that this is understood also in places like China and in many places in Asia, and hopefully also in North America, not just in Canada, in the future. Now, I think I've tried in answering to answer everyone, regardless of where they stand on this issue. But let me point to a certain form of irony. Those who have strong reservations against the European project in general, let me put it in the kindest possible terms I can find, who would have cried havoc had Europe ever, the European Union ever, considered wanting to take up competences in the field of healthcare, and who would have resisted that with all the means they have, are now crying havoc because Europe is not acting in the field of healthcare. You can't have it both ways. Either you give Europe the means to act in this area, whether it is because of the political consensus that Europe should or not, or you accept that Europe has no competences and then you focus on the member states. But you can't, on the one hand, dispute Europe's role in this, and then on the other hand, criticize Europe for not having played that role. I think that is highly, highly unfair. Having said that, let me just come back to my fundamental point today. Climate change, it might not be the huge, enormous, sudden shock that we are now with COVID-19 that makes so many people sick and kills so many people and is such a direct threat to our society. But climate change you could compare to high blood pressure. If it is neglected, it will kill you. And this is going on and on and on, and it will not disappear simply because we say we don't want to make it a priority. And it would be a strong dereliction of duty of everyone in political responsibility, regardless of where they stand in politics, to simply close their eyes for what is happening in droughts in the south of Europe, in erratic weather that's causing havoc, in enormous disruptions of harvests everywhere, in people being killed because of all of this. And this is only going to get worse if we don't keep the rise of temperature down. This is not something we can ignore. It would be highly irresponsible to simply say, well, we have other priorities now. Forget about this luxury. It is not a luxury. It's about survival of humanity. I cannot stress this enough. Now, moving to the issue of fiscality, I would underline that this crisis has brought home the point that we really need to look at our fiscal policies, both at a national level and a European level as well. Both because we need fiscal capacity to act, but also because I think we need to revisit the fiscal constructions we have had in the past, which left major corporations with huge profits without them paying any taxes. I think that is an unsustainable way of doing this. We will not move back on biodiversity. Let me again repeat, I said it, biodiversity farm to fork, initially end of April. We might be a couple of weeks later, but certainly not months. I just want to, for the record, to repeat that. And I've spoken about the effects of the crisis. And I also want to reiterate what I've said several times now that I get this question about bonds. I think if the debate about how we organize solidarity stays focused on yes or no to corona bonds, then this will lead to a deadlock. We have to find ways of creating solidarity so that we have a level playing field, so that also countries that will not be able to access means on the financial markets easily or at a too high cost have the means to invest in their economy to get out of this. We need to create a European level of solidarity on this, and this needs to be done very quickly indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frans. We have 8 people on the list for the last round. So we will be right on time. So please stick to the minute allocated to you. We will start with the EPP and Mr. Kanef.
Hello. I hope you do hear me.
Yeah, we can.
Thank you. So first of all, I would point out that I fully support the concept, the idea of green recovery, and think that it gives huge chances for European industry and economy in the recovery period. And then straight on the question, what I really miss in the climate law draft is exactly the reference to the green recovery, to the Just Transition Fund regulation, to the Green Deal investment plan. For me, the climate law draft stands somehow isolated. It doesn't link to the financial incentive. It doesn't link to the taxonomy either. So it raises, especially in Eastern Europe, where I come from, it raises the fears that we might end up with limitation laws, but with no incentive legal frame. And another example on this, just last few words, why is in the climate law no provision about monitoring not only the member state measures, but the regional just transition plans either? Thank you very much.
Thank you. For SND, Mr. Lopez, who is in the room.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Timmermans, it's a pleasure to have an exchange of views with you today. I wanted to talk to you about the nature and scale and the links to the community of the recovery fund, how it all fits into the system. Of course, we want to have a recovery of solidarity, a just recovery. To manage the future, of course, it means that we will have to be able to restart our economies, but pushing our economies in the green direction, give a boost to local economies. But I want to talk to you about the scale of the capacity to issue debt, in a word, and also how this is all going to work in this community context. Parliament, of course, has been, very much involved in the new Green Deal.
Thank you. For Renew, Martin Ocik.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to hear, Commissioner, your continued support, not only for the Green Deal, but also for the Green Recovery and praise for the Green Recovery Alliance. Now, you mentioned important element, that's the renovation of the buildings, but I think that's not only about the renovation itself, but what it showcases is the entire supply chain of the renovations. That's a huge opportunity. But I would like to go beyond that. It's not only about the energy and kind of the energy consumption, energy savings, but I think, and I would like to ask you about how do you perceive the connection to the the circular economy action plan and also the upcoming sustainable chemical strategy, because as a Europe, we still face the problem in the waste, we still face the problems with hazardous chemicals, and where do you see the space for enhancing this area within the green recovery? Where do you see the investment opportunities also supported by the public funding for some more circular economy in Europe?
Thank you. For the Greens, Michael Bloss.
Hello. Thank you, Mr. Timmermans. Thank you, Pascal Canfin. On the climate law, I think it's not fully in line with the provisions of the Paris Agreement. It should be in line with Article 2, which says climate neutrality, the 1.5 degree temperature rise goal, and financial flows. How will you align it, or how do you think we can align it with the Paris Agreement? Also, taking into consideration that I think currently it does not permit Europe to take part in the 2025 NDC update. Second question, countries like Germany have not yet submitted their national climate and energy plans. how does that impact your impact assessment for the climate law? Third is the question about state aid. You said it should be central to put the Green Deal and the recovery together. How do you ensure it with state aid plans? And that maybe the last question is, there is another huge crisis on the way with the climate crisis, a big drought in Germany. It's only 4% of normal rainfall in April. Do you also have plans to react to this crisis?
Thank you. For ICIA, Herman Tertsch.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timmermans. You've been talking about flexibility, because listening to what some people are saying at the moment, I feel they're not really aware of how things are in certain countries, in particular a country like my own in Spain, given the disastrous reaction by the Spanish government, which has placed us really at the summit of the crisis. We've seen the total collapse of small and medium-sized industries in Spain, along with all the sacrifices that the Green Deal requires. It's going to be impossible for us to have any kind of work. The people who survive the virus will end up dying of hunger otherwise, or be left in eternal unemployment. So you have to bear in mind that all that has happened has radically changed the deal.
Thank you. For the GUE, Mikulas, who is in the room.
Thanks very much, Mr. President. And thank you, Commissioner Timmermans. I agree 100% with you that the crisis has certainly presented an opportunity for us to do things different. And it would be an absolute shame if we don't avail of it. You spoke about the need for a level playing field, and I think that's very important as well. But achieving it is going to be the big challenge. And whether they're called Corona bonds or whatever they're called, do you not think that the member states who are in the most difficulty, that the burden on them is going to have to be shared by everybody in Europe if we are to establish solidarity, which we certainly need? Listen, the Green Deal was never going to come cheap anyway. It costs money to make things done better, whether it's in farming and encouraging farmers to produce cleaner food, whether it's in construction, building better houses, whatever it is, it's always going to cost money. And now we have a huge bill from the coronavirus crisis, and I'm just wondering how you envisage the level playing field being established, given that some member states will need more help than others, and if they don't get it, they're going to be driven towards more austerity, which will not help them to move to a greener situation. Thanks very much.
Thank you. For the EPP, Rosatun und Ozenstein. Okay, we can see you, but we can't hear you.
Madam Thun, could you please press the speak button?
No, you should press the speak button.
I will press it.
Okay, so we'll get back to you. We have still 3 speakers. The next one is Maria Rodriguez Ramos, but she...
Are you here?
Okay, you're back. Okay, we can hear you. It's okay. Can't, so Madame Rodriguez Ramos for Renew. You asked for the floor, but then I think you were disconnected. Okay, she's disconnected. So the last one is Marie Toussaint for the Greens. Okay, so we are not lucky with the three last ones.
Madame Toussaint, could you please press the speak button?
Do you hear?
It's okay now for Ozatun.
Do you hear?
Yeah, we can hear you.
That's complicated. Anyhow, the president said in the very beginning of his speech that the Green Deal is not a luxury, and this is pretty evident. And I also see in your comments that you write in this discussion, Green Deal is about job creation, and many positive comments. But the huge issue today is the communication with our citizens. Is there a strategy in the European Commission to communicate that it's not either COVID recovery or Green Deal, but that both are possible without excluding anybody and anyone, and that we need both really in order to recover and in order to secure the future? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, do we have Marie Toussaint for the Greens? 1, 2, 3. We don't. And do we have Maria Rodriguez Ramos for Renew? 1, 2, 3. We don't neither. So back to you, Frans, for the final remarks on your side.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking your committee for all the questions and thoughts. And let me just start by saying that, you know, I can see and feel the levels of despair that this COVID crisis has created, and I can see the worries people have about their jobs, about how they're going to come out of this, about their health, about their kids, and etc. But we can sort of wallow in that, but that's a luxury we cannot afford. We have to take the responsibility for the recovery, and if we make an analysis of the necessities to get recovery, we cannot neglect the fact that the climate crisis is still upon us. And so we have to make sure that we use the, by definition, limited instruments we have, which will have to be used to full capacity, to not just recover from this crisis, but to make the recovery sustainable. It is, whether you're in favor of the Green Deal, yes or no, you can call it whatever you like, but this will be an essential requirement, because if we only use the limited means we have to restore the old, many of the old things of which we know that they will have to be reformed anyway, by the time they run out of steam and out of jobs and out of growth, we will no longer have the fiscal and other capacity to invest to make them new. So I would argue that by pretending now is only about recovery along the old systematic, I would argue that if you do that, you do a huge disservice to next generations, because they will be left with the remnants of an economy and a society that is not future-proof. So it is not out of obsession with the Green Deal that I say that it's a result of a almost clinical analysis of where we are as a society and as a world, and I think this will sink in more and more everywhere. I do agree when it is said that the climate law should be intertwined with the other instruments we have, whether it's taxonomy, whether it's the circular economy and how we need to invest in that, whether it's what we do on digitization. It is all part of this big movement, which is a recovery plan and also a new growth plan for Europe. We will have to find the financial means for this, and we will have to create a level playing field. Whatever you call the fund, that was already decided in principle by the Eurogroup, and that will be form part of the discussion in the next days and weeks. Whatever you call it, what it needs to do is to make sure that everybody has the capacity to invest on a fair basis to get out of this crisis, and that member states that simply cannot muster this investment on their own are left behind. That would at the end, it would destroy the European Union. It would certainly start by destroying the internal market. It would create such discrepancies within the European Union that the system would no longer work. And I hope those countries who are not on board yet to create this level of solidarity come round to seeing this, because it's in their own interest to make sure that nobody stumbles and falls and drags everybody down. I really like this analysis of the building supply chain linked into the circular economy, which links directly to building itself, but also in the broader sense. And yes, indeed, it will affect. Just imagine what happens in the cement industry to make it sustainable. Just imagine that Europe can produce steel without using fossil fuels in the future, how this would change the whole paradigm of our economy, etc. So also these things are really linked. Yes, there are national plans. I think it is important that we try and coordinate the national plans as much as we can, so that there are no contradictions and false competition between member states. As far as our impact assessment is concerned in September, I hope that we will have all the national plans by then, so that our impact assessment can be done accordingly. I already answered the issue of state aid. I think there is a dire need to create some form of coordinated European approach, so that, again, we do not create differences, distorting differences between member states on the basis of their fiscal possibilities or impossibilities. I think this is very important. Those who say that this changes everything radically are absolutely right. But to go from there and then say that this changed so radically that we should lose our focus on the climate crisis and on other crises, biodiversity and others, I think they are misguided if they say this. They are misguided. It might be, I know it is difficult in political terms, in human terms. We're in the middle of putting out a fire, and at the same time we are talking about constructing a better, more sustainable new house for ourselves. That's always difficult, because everybody will say, what are you talking about? We're in a fire, put out the fire. But if we put out the fire and then don't start constructing the new house, we will lose time, we will lose money, and we will be left with a house that is not sustainable. So I understand the emotional tension here, but it is a matter of political responsibility not to dodge the longer term issue of how we reconstruct and in which direction. I already said something about the level playing field and the burden sharing. I think I've been very clear on that. And let me end by giving an example, because Rosa Thun mentioned it, but also other honourable members from Poland mentioned it. These things cannot be undissociated. I mentioned the car industry and to see how the car industry comes to us. And there are car factories everywhere, also in Poland, that have a lot of people working for them. And these jobs are extremely important, and mobility will be extremely important. But if we could help the car industry by saying, okay, we will have ecological scrapping schemes so that we take some of the most polluting cars out of the equation, and we offer the possibility to European citizens who, don't tell me that this crisis leads to the fact that nobody can have mobility anymore. That's not the issue. Let's not go there. But we can take the most polluting cars out of the equation and give the opportunity for cleaner cars, hopefully zero emission cars. It's good for the car industry, it's good for jobs, and it's good for the environment. So please try and adopt that state of mind when we think of the measures we will have to take. Mr. President, I think I should stop here and thank you so much for your patience and for this opportunity, and I hope we can continue our dialogue also in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. We are done for this meeting today. The next meeting of the ENVI committee is scheduled for May the 4th, and I hope we will be able to have it on such a device. And I would like to thank, of course, the participants, of course, Frans Timmermans, but also the staff behind the fact that we managed to have it quite smoothly, I would say, beyond a few difficulties we had at the beginning. But thank you very much to the staff of the ENVI committee and to the IT and to the interpreters. So thank you again, and have a good day where you are locked down. Bye-bye.